You all for coming. Oh, okay. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm not going to say very much. Lamoille neighbors would like to thank Debbie Steinerman particularly for coming and giving us this talk. Debbie is tireless. Anybody who knows her knows that. She has done an amazing job creating the Vermont Holocaust Memorial. She has, from its inception, she has been dedicated and worked tirelessly to make this come to fruition. And those of us who know her are both impressed and enormously proud of her. So with that, I will turn the whatever over to Debbie.
Thank you, Ellen, and Amy, thank you very much, and Lanford Memorial Library as well for hosting this Zoom talk with me and about the Vermont Holocaust Memorial. Just to introduce myself, I am a second generation Holocaust survivor, or a 2G as we refer to ourselves. That means that I am a daughter of Holocaust survivors. My mother was a survivor of the Holocaust, and I am now her descendant. I am a second generation survivor of the Holocaust. Had she not survived, I would not be here, so I am also a survivor. I grew up in New York, as I'm told, you can tell by my accent, which I don't hear. I got married and lived on Long Island until our children grew up and moved away themselves. We sold our house and moved up to Jeffersonville, where we live now, in 2013. And we love our life here in Vermont. I am a co-founder and the president of the Vermont Holocaust Memorial. The memorial was started in 2017. Let me share my screen, and if I can remember how to do that, and start my presentation. Okay, looks like I may have done it correctly. So the Vermont Holocaust Memorial, as I said, it was started in 2017. It's a registered 501c3 charitable organization, nonprofit. When I give my talks about the Holocaust and about my family's story, I like to start with the definition of the Holocaust. And I'm going to read it to you. The Holocaust was the systematic state-sponsored persecution, discrimination, and murder of 6 million Jews by Hitler's Nazi regime and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945 across Europe and beyond. Beyond because it was Hitler's intention to continue his murder of the Jews. He was intending to murder all Jews throughout the world. Also, I like to point out that it was state-sponsored, and it didn't start as murder. It was persecution, it was discrimination. It started with words. My family's story takes place in Slovakia. My parents grew up in Slovakia. They did not know each other as children. My parents met in New York. We'll get to that later on in the story. But the story that I'm going to tell you is about my mother's family. They grew up in a town near the Hungarian border in Slovakia. So most of the story takes place in that town, in Slovakia, in Hungary, and in Poland. Poland because of the concentration camp, Auschwitz, as part of the story. On the left, you'll see a picture of my mother's family. My mother is Eva, and her sister Kathy. They were about a year and a half, 2 years apart in age. Kathy was older, and they're with their parents, my grandparents, Eugene and Francisca. They lived in a town called Nové Zámky. Again, it was in Slovakia, what is now Slovakia, It had gone back and forth between being Hungary, Czechoslovakia, now Slovakia. At the time, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. My grandfather had a houseware store in that town. He sold pots, pans, linens, glassware, anything you needed to run a house. He was well liked. He was well known. He had many customers. He was very friendly with them. The Jews before World War II, before 1938 in Nowy Zamki and in that part of Eastern Europe, they lived very happily and mingled with everyone else in the town. It was a typical East European town. It had churches, it had synagogues, it had a town square. The Jews in the town at the time were involved in municipal life. They held elected offices. They were regular parts of the community, and had no problems with their neighbors and friends. This is a picture of my mother and my aunt in their Jewish elementary school in 1934. This was a class of elementary students, but of different ages, obviously. One school class included different age groups. In 1930, still allowed to have a Jewish school, and they enjoyed going to class and learning with their contemporaries. As they grew up, though, they were still able to enjoy life just like any other teenager. They went to the park with friends, they played sports, they socialized, they went to the local pool. My mother and her sister were able to take music lessons, language lessons, they played sports. They lived what was a typical teenage life, I think, until probably about 1940. 1938, the Hungarians took over and things started to get a little worse. Anti-Jewish laws were starting to be put into place, and as time passed, that got much more difficult for the Jews in their town of Nowy Zamki. They slowly were forbidden to do business on certain streets. My grandfather's store was taken away from him. Cars were taken away if they were owned, bicycles were taken away, radios were taken away. More and more restrictions were placed on the Jews in that area. And they were restricted from going to movies, from going to the park at certain times of day. They had to abide by a curfew. By 1941, I believe, my grandfather was taken to work in forced labor. His family had a little bit of communications with him for a little while, and then at some point around 1942, they lost contact with him. They later learned that he was taken to the Auschwitz concentration camp and was put into hard labor there. As these restrictions were put on the Jews in the town, the children were not allowed, Jewish children were not allowed to go to school anymore. They had to either find work, and any work that they found would have had to have been for another Jew. They could not work for non-Jews, or they had to learn a trade. So my mother decided to, whoops, I went the wrong way. My mother decided to go in 1942, she went to Budapest. She went to learn to be a photographer's assistant and trained for that there. Budapest was not too far from her hometown. It was probably about an hour's bus ride. And while she was in Budapest, she met a young man who became her boyfriend. Now, I just want to stop right here and I show you this picture because the smaller picture is a picture that I found amongst my mother's photo albums. And I had traveled to Budapest a number of years ago, and I saw what is on the right is a memorial to the Jews of Budapest. And I couldn't believe my mother was standing in that same spot in 1942, which now is a memorial to the Jews that were killed on that spot. They were told to take off their shoes, and they were shot in the back, and they fell into the Danube River and washed away. And when I describe this and I show this picture to students in schools, I point out, first of all, that this is a memorial. These are not actual shoes. They're made of stone or iron, but you can see that they're all different sizes, all different shapes. There are men's shoes, there are women's shoes, there are dress shoes, there are casual shoes, children's shoes. And I ask, why do you think, why would the Nazis tell the Jews to take their shoes off before they were going to shoot and kill them? What was the point? And students most of the time were dumbfounded, you know, but some do come up with the answer because they have learned in class a bit of the background that every piece, every material, every item that was owned by the Jews had some value to the Nazis. The shoes as well. They could have been used by their family. They could have been traded and sold. You know, in wartime, everything had unusual value. So back to the story, my mother was living and learning and in Budapest to be a photographer's assistant. She met this young man, became her boyfriend. He was a German with some Jewish heritage, but he was German, and he was working with the underground resistance. And he knew a bit about what was going on. He knew that people were disappearing. He heard rumors. He was involved in a bit of resistance, and he wanted to help save my mother. He had gotten another girlfriend's original identification papers. She kept a copy, and he gave the original identification papers to my mother, and she had to learn everything she could about this other woman, a non-Jewish woman named Anna Papai. My mother was going to become Anna. Now, Anna was a little bit older than my mother. Anna had blonde hair. My mother was a brunette. She had to learn Anna's address. She had to learn the name of Anna's parents. She had to learn everything she could to become Anna. And once she learned as much as she could, she dyed her hair blonde. And one night she took a kerchief, covered her hair, put her coat on with its telltale yellow star, identifying her as a Jew, and she walked to the riverside. At that point, this was at night, she took off her coat with its star, left it on the riverbank. She had her pocketbook, which she also left on the riverbank. Inside her pocketbook was her own original identification papers for Eva Grunstein, and she left that in the pocketbook. And she also had in her pocketbook a letter, a note, a suicide note, which she left on the riverbank. She took off the kerchief and she ran to meet her boyfriend. They had warned her mother that they may hear something, but not to believe anything that they're told. But that was all her family knew. They didn't know if what they were told, if they were told, we don't know. If it was true or not, that she killed herself. They didn't know where she was. They didn't know what was going to happen to her. They wanted to protect my mother's family. The less they knew, the better. So in the meantime, her boyfriend found her a job as a nanny in rural Hungary, far away from the big city of Budapest. He was able to secure this job for her because my mother had a lot of talent. She had learned languages. She learned to play piano and accordion. Music was a very big part of her upbringing. And she was very active in sports. Even to the day she died, she played tennis. My mother was very active and very much into sports. So these were qualities that were hard to find at the time, especially in non-Jews, which my mother supposedly was at this point, right? So she got this job to be a nanny in rural Hungary. She lived under a false identity. She lived as Anna Papai, and she had some pictures of that time that she had kept. In the picture on the top right, you'll see, possibly if you look closely, you can see she's wearing a cross around her neck. She did whatever she could to be Anna, to be a non-Jew, to act like a non-Jew, to answer, to take part in whatever activities the family partaked in. She was with them. She went with them to church. She went with them to parties as the babysitter, as the nanny for the children. She went on vacations with them. She lived out in the open and hid out in the open as Anna Papai. Now, while my mother was living this false identity, her sister, Kathy, also had to learn a trade or work in some way. So she decided to become a teacher. She could only teach Jewish students. Jews could not work for or have clients that were non-Jews. So the Jews in town, there were students that wanted to learn accordion, and Kathy taught music lessons. She taught piano, she taught accordion. And this picture, the larger picture, is a picture of her students in 1943, who she had taught accordion. There's a picture of Kathy in the top right corner. None of her students in this picture survived the Holocaust. Kathy thankfully did. But she didn't know what was going to happen. They learned that they were going to be put into a ghetto. And when word got out that that was coming up, Kathy decided to put her most treasured possession, her accordion, away. She wanted to hide it, and she buried it in the family's backyard. She had hoped that she'd come back and be able to retrieve it, or that it would be found and somehow survive. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. In 1944, they were put into a ghetto. The ghetto was not your typical, houses with crowded people in sharing one room apartments, as we've heard, like about the Warsaw Ghetto. At this point in this part of Eastern Europe, they were put in a brick factory. They were gathered, the Jews were gathered, told to take, one bag, and they were all gathered into this brick factory in the nearby town. In June of 1944, 2 days, transports were packed with the Jews from the area and sent off to Auschwitz, the largest the most infamous of the Nazi concentration camps. When Kathy got to Auschwitz after a few days on the train with her mother, they got off the train and she held on tight to her mother's arm. They were in line and brought in front of what they found out to be Dr. Mengele, the infamous Nazi doctor, who was pointing to the right or to the left. You go to the left, you go to the right. And those that were sent to the left, as we know, went to their death in the gas chambers. Those that were sent to the right had a reprieve for a little while. They were sent to labor. They seemed useful. The Nazis needed help in continuing their plan for the final solution. Kathy was strong. She was young. She had talent. And she thankfully was sent to the right. She grabbed her mother's arm and pulled her with her, and they went to the right. This is a picture of Kathy's tattoo on her arm. She took part in the Shoah Foundation's testimony archive. And this is a grab of the picture showing her tattoo from Auschwitz. Once you were deemed to live, such as it was, you were given a number. And from then on, you were only known by that number. You were no longer a name. You were no longer considered human. You were just a number, and you had to answer to that number on roll call, early in the morning, late at night, any time that they lined you up, you had to know your number. And of course, how could you forget your number if it's on your arm? Kathy, as I said, was talented. At first, Kathy was put into the Auschwitz orchestra, an orchestra in a prison camp, in an extermination camp. The orchestra was used, yes, at times to entertain the Nazis, but most of the time, the point of the orchestra was to play marching music. As you can see in this drawing, the prisoners in the background are marching while the orchestra is playing. The marching music got them moving, got them hurrying up to get to work or hurrying up to come back from work. It was very regimented. Kathy was only in the orchestra for a very short time because this was already late 1944. They needed more workers in their factories. She was sent to work in a munitions factory, pressing out in a machine airplane parts. And in that factory were other women from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, who, all spoke their native languages. And really that is all. Kathy, as I said, like my mother, she learned languages growing up. They were fortunate to have special language lessons. And one of those languages that they learned was German. In this factory was a German civilian foreman, and he only spoke German. He was very happy to learn that Kathy could have conversations with him because she spoke German. And they befriended each other as much as they could in a situation like that. But this foreman was very grateful and took favor with Kathy. And each morning when she arrived at her station, she would find a piece of bread hidden underneath the machine that she was working on. That extra ration of bread that this man hid for her, she would hide in a pocket in her uniform and bring back to the barracks to share with her mother. And that extra ration of bread saved their lives. It gave them that extra little bit of nutrition that they needed to last until the Russians came and liberated Auschwitz. And that happened in 1945. They thankfully, my Aunt Kathy and her mother and her aunt survived Auschwitz and were able to return back to their community in Nowy Zamki, back to their home, and wait to see who else survived. In the meantime, my mother was still living in rural Hungary under the assumed identity. The Russians were coming to liberate, and she told the family that she was working for that she wanted to go and find her boyfriend and reunite with him in Budapest, and she left. She found her boyfriend, but there was a lot of chaos going on in Budapest at the time. There were still some Nazis there, and they captured my mother, and they captured the boyfriend and some others that they were with from the resistance, and they started questioning them. But remember, my mother had original identification papers from Anna Papai. She still had them. She was still pretending to be Anna. And as far as the Nazis were concerned, these were original papers. My mother resembled the description of Anna. She knew everything about Anna, and she understood German. She understood what the Nazis were saying, and she was a very strong woman. She had laughed and pretended she was not scared, and the Nazis saw that, and they released her. They released her boyfriend as well. He was a German, and they were able to get back onto the road. Unfortunately, some of the others that were captured with them were not so fortunate. So they got back on the road and they made their way to Yugoslavia. At the time, it was free, and that's where they lived for the next year or so as Eastern Europe was recovering from the war. In late 1946 or 1947, my mother returned to her hometown where she found her sister and her mother still alive. Very few other members of the family had survived, but they were so happy to see each other and be together again. But my mother decided she didn't want to stay in their hometown. She wasn't returning to Yugoslavia. She wanted to go out into the world and live her life. She didn't want to stay where all this tragedy was. She moved on to a DP camp in Italy. DP is a displaced persons camp for refugees that were set up in different parts of Europe. She was staying in one for about a year and a half in Italy until she got released a permission to travel to Israel. And my mother arrived in Israel in early 1950. She got a job working for an airline in Israel. She worked for KLM, the Dutch airline in Israel. That was a new thing, having air transportation back then. It was a very big deal. She was considered a ground hostess. She greeted VIPs. And while she was there, one of the VIPs that she greeted was the author Leon Uris, who wrote the book Exodus about the founding of the state of Israel. And she became his assistant while he was traveling around the country, helping him do his research. Part of his research, part of his book does take some of her survival story into account into his book. And they became close friends for a long time there. She was hoping that when he went back to the United States, he would find a way to sponsor her to come to the United States. It was very difficult for refugees at that time to get permission to immigrate to the United States. She had hoped a friend of hers in Canada could help. That didn't work out either. she had a hard time. She enjoyed her life in Israel, don't get me wrong, but she wanted, like everyone else, she wanted to come to the United States. And finally, in 1957, that happened for my mother. She got transferred to the KLM headquarters in New York. She got a job in Manhattan. And from then on, her life continued in the United States, and she met my father, and here I am. And these are the descendants of Kathy and my mother, Eva. Had they not survived, had they not had help from people who dared to risk their lives, to either give identification papers, to hide them, to smuggle food to them, if they didn't have that and a great deal of luck, we would not be here. This picture was taken in 2014 at a wedding in Israel. By now, we are now, what, 9 years later, 8 years later. There are a few more members of the family, thank God. And we are so happy to be able to get together for happy occasions like this and think about how, had our mothers not survived, we would not be here. There is a plaque in the synagogue in the town that Eva and Kathy grew up in Novi Zamki, that names 2,300 Jewish community members that perished in the Holocaust. Originally, there were, in 1938, there were about 3,000 Jews in the town. 2,300 of those Jews were killed in the Holocaust. We're very lucky to have our parents that survived that. Of the 9 million Jews that were living in Europe before the war, 6 million, or 2/3, were murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators in the Holocaust. The Nazis were pretty successful. It was horrible. Of those 6 million that were murdered, 1.5 million were children. Imagine all those lives cut short. But it wasn't just Jews. We point out when we give our talks, it wasn't just Jews that were targeted by the Nazis. 6 million Jews were murdered. 5 million others were also murdered for all different reasons, for nationalities, for beliefs, for, just for who they, if they were physically disabled, if they were homeless, if they were Polish, mentally disabled, communists. I mean, you see the list, and there were more. If they didn't meet the Nazis' requirements of a perfect Aryan, they were deemed useless. So my organization, the Vermont Holocaust Memorial, is a virtual organization. We do not have a facility. We consider ourselves a museum without walls, so to speak. Our speakers, our projects, our exhibits are all mobile. We go to schools, we go to organizations. In the last couple of years now, we've been giving our presentations virtually. We believe there are invaluable lessons to be learned by studying the Holocaust, and that by engaging and educating the community, we hope for a time when prejudice, bigotry, and hatred will be replaced with respect for all. We inspire adults and children to consider the real consequences of their choices. We open their minds. We challenge students to think critically and to become upstanders, not bystanders. We do this because it is our responsibility as children of survivors of the Holocaust. Soon there won't be many left. It's our obligation to tell their stories, to share those lessons. If we don't, who will? And we are hoping that the next generation, the 3Gs and the 4Gs, will continue these important testimonies. As Elie Wiesel said, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. So we listened to our parents when they told these stories, and now we're witnesses. Why is it important to study the Holocaust? Because we have responsibilities. We have a responsibility to remember the lives that were lost, all those millions and millions of people who were individuals who were given a number and they lost their names, they lost their dreams, they lost their families, they lost their lives. We have a responsibility to prevent hate. We teach in our talks, we teach students that they can't demonize others that are not like themselves, that this horrible event occurred starting with words of hate.
I'm listening.
And we have a responsibility to protect each other. We don't want this kind of evil to take place again. The Vermont Holocaust Memorial started in 2017. It started as a small temporary exhibit at the Jewish community of Greater Stowe. We put together about 9 family stories of members whose families survived the Holocaust. It was paper and cardboard. It was supposed to last for about 2 weeks. It ended up being there for about 3 months. It was shared with the church across the street, St. John's in the Mountains. They wanted us to bring the exhibit into their building, share with their members. It stayed in a classroom at the Jewish community of Greater Stowe, as I said, for about 3 months. We learned that teachers heard about our exhibit and they wanted to bring their classes. They wanted us to have speakers to speak to their students, to share these stories and supplement what they were teaching from textbooks in classes. We learned that there was no other Holocaust memorial or museum of any type in the state. That hit us, that hit home for us. And we decided we needed to keep this going. And we became a nonprofit institution in 2017 and continued our work from there. We bring our family stories, as I said, to classrooms, to libraries, to organizations and communities of all types and all sizes. We share our family stories and we supplement what the teachers teach, the facts in the classrooms, and we share the personal stories with them. This is a list of some of the locations that we've already spoken to. Many of these we have returned to numerous times. We also have what we call our LEAF project. Our LEAF project is a memorial to the 1.5 million children that perished in the Holocaust. Our aim is to collect 1.5 million individually created leaves. Now, why do we collect leaves? Leaves grow on trees. We know that Vermont has beautiful trees and foliage. We're known for that. Trees also represent families. Trees have branches like families have branches. Trees have roots just as families do. What better way to learn about memorializing this tragic event and this loss by creating and collecting memorial leaves. At this time, we have just under 2,000. The LEAF project has been in existence for about 2 years. It's going to take a very, very long time for us to reach 1.5 million leaves, but that's the point. The point that that's 1.5 million children, an unfathomable number, but we're planning to collect them. And sometimes we see students write words of hope and words of caring and inspiration on their leaves. Some teachers have assigned the project to their classes to do research and create leaves in memory of specific people that perished or children that perished in the Holocaust. They do research and they write a name and they write a little bit of background on the leaves. And once the class is finished with the project, they send us their leaves. We also have an exhibit that we share. We have two versions. We have retractable panels, as you can see on the left, and we have similar exhibit that can be mounted on the wall. This exhibit has appeared in libraries. It has appeared alongside theater productions that have a connection to the Holocaust. Like, of course, The Diary of Anne Frank. Many times we've accompanied that. We were at the Lost Nation Theater in Montpelier with Becoming Dr. Ruth. Dr. Ruth was a child survivor of the Holocaust. And Cabaret, which of course took place during World War II. Vermont Holocaust Memorial works very hard to publicize our work and publicize the need for Holocaust education in the state. We've been appearing in many of local newspapers throughout the state. Here are some examples of some of the stories that covered our work and op-eds that we have done. Why do we do this? Because Vermont isn't immune from anti-Semitism and racism. We know that. Some examples of events that have taken place in the last couple of years throughout the state are shown here in St. Albans, in Brattleboro, in Swanton. Unfortunately, graffiti and hate flyers do show up in the state. If we don't educate our children about how wrong this is, how it, right now, it may be about Jews, or it may be about Blacks, or it may be about Asians, but who knows what's next? And maybe it may be them. It's unacceptable, and they need to learn these important lessons so that this won't continue to happen. There was a survey done by an organization called the Claims Conference. They did a survey of the 50 states on Holocaust knowledge. And the results here show Vermonters' knowledge of the Holocaust. Now, Vermont was not the worst, but it certainly was not the best in education on the Holocaust. As you can see, there 65% didn't know that 6 million Jews were killed. 7% even thought Jews caused the Holocaust. Thankfully, 79% believe it is important to continue teaching about the Holocaust so it doesn't happen again. And that's something that we are really working on right now. Obviously, we all know that the Holocaust was not the last genocide. Unfortunately, there have been more. We can say never again. We really hope at some point that will be true, that there will not be any more genocides. But that will only happen with education. Currently, we have some special projects going on. We have an educators workshop that's scheduled in Burlington for March 22nd. The focus of that workshop will be analyzing propaganda and teaching media literacy with a focus on the Holocaust. We've got 32 Vermont educators registered for that workshop right now. We've had workshops in the past. This is our first workshop since the pandemic. Prior to that, we've had 2 other workshops, each had about 40 participants as well. So we're looking forward to this in-person workshop again. We have currently taking place a student Holocaust education competition. The competition asks students to respond to the question, how does the story of one Holocaust survivor inspire you or give you hope in the face of today's challenges? They can respond with prose, with poetry, with a film, with an art project. It's for ages 9 through 18. It's separated into 3 different age categories, and we give out awards in each category. The deadline for submissions has just been extended to May 2nd. We're also working with legislators in Vermont to bring about Holocaust and genocide education standards in our schools. If you know or have contact with your local legislator, please emphasize to them how important you think this is for our students. A big project that we started this year is to design and create a Holocaust memorial for the state. As I said, there is none. We have begun working with university art and architecture students who had submitted design ideas to us. We've gone through those. They've been presented to us with background and very much detail. We have narrowed it down to a few designs that we think at Vermont Holocaust Memorial are very commemorative, but we're looking for feedback from the general public. And if that's something that you think that you might be interested in helping us with, I would love to have you contact us, and we would include you in a panel that would review these design ideas. And lastly, coming up this month, March 21st through May 1st in Burlington at the Fletcher Free Library, we are working with the library to bring the Courage to Remember exhibit. It is the Simon Wiesenthal Center's traveling exhibit about the Holocaust. It is an educational exhibit of 40 panels that will be set up in the main reading area of the library. And in conjunction with that exhibit, there will be numerous programs, book review, book talks, films, discussions, all part of this March 21st through May 1st exhibit. In addition, there will also be on April 28th, a Holocaust commemoration event taking place at the library. And all this information will be found on the library's website if you're interested. And I hope you'll find time to go into Burlington and take a close look at this exhibit, because it really is a first for the state and a very important educational opportunity for all. Finally, I just want to share Elie Wiesel's quote that I think sums up what the Vermont Holocaust Memorial does and believes in. He said that the opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And just like we ask students to learn to be an upstander, not a bystander, don't be indifferent to hate. If you see something that rubs you the wrong way, that you know is wrong, if someone is being bullied or saying the wrong things, say something, stand up, make a difference. Finally, I like to share the names of 23 of my relatives, 23 of the 6 million that I know of. I know the names of that were killed in the Holocaust. These were my grandfather, aunts, uncles, cousins that I never got to know. And I don't want their names to be forgotten. These were individuals whose lives were cut short. They had families, they had dreams, they had futures that were taken from them and taken from the world. And I like to point out to students that of these 6 million, who knows what could have been? Who knows what person could have developed into a doctor or a lawyer or a discoverer of a cure for cancer or for COVID, you know, could have gotten us to Mars by now. We don't know what we lost. I don't know what I lost in these relatives of mine that I never got to know. The number of the lost from the Holocaust is so horrific, we can't wrap our heads around it. So the personal accounts that the Vermont Holocaust Memorial shares brings the faces and names and personalities to the facts and figures that are taught in the schools. It's vital that we remember these stories and these names. Thank you for taking part in this event, for listening to my talk. I hope if you have questions, I'll be able to answer them. If you have other questions or for more information on how you can support our organization, our website address is here on the bottom. It's very simple, holocaustmemorial-vt.org. You can learn more about our projects there. You can learn more about personal family stories there from Vermonters whose families survived the Holocaust. And I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Thank you, Debbie, so much. There is a question in the chat to start us off, and then maybe if other people have questions, you can turn your video on. I can stop recording now too, if that makes sense for folks. Anyway, the question in the chat is, how is your organization funded and how many members do you have?
So our organization is funded solely by donations. We are a very small organization. We have a board of about 5. On our board is myself. I have a background in public relations and law. We have educators, 2 educators on our board, one a former educator, one a current Vermont teacher who teaches Holocaust studies class. We have a psychologist on our board, and we have a High Park resident, Miriam Rosenblum, who is also a child of survivors and was a docent at the Holocaust Museum in Houston. Otherwise, we are starting to get other members as speakers. We're always looking for more stories and ways to share those stories. We have also gotten contact with some students, some young students, some high school students who have shown a great deal of interest in Holocaust education. And with them, we have gotten into the legislature. The legislators love to listen to students and what students think are needed in our state. And these youngsters have spoken out. And we have now 2 high school students from Mount Abe as interns on our board. We are working with a UVM student who has been very outspoken and has spoken to her legislator in Rutland and has prompted a bill that has been brought in front of the Senate Education Committee now. Are there any other questions that I can?
There are some really sweet comments in the chat, Debbie. There's a person who has the Snapchat ears in her photo. She said, "Hi there, I listened to this today because my grandfather and great aunt were survivors and were on Schindler's List. They were very lucky, and I'm only here today because of their strength. That's all I have to say. Other than that, I enjoyed very much hearing this today, and thank you with all my heart."
Thank you. We would love to hear more about your family story. That's something that we are always gathering and hoping to gather and learn more about. We know that there are more stories out there. There was a petition started by these 2 students that are now the interns on our board. They started a petition on their own for Holocaust education in the schools. And through that petition, they asked, you know, people's opinions, people's connection, and they found that there are a number of Vermonters who have family connection to the Holocaust. And this is a very hard thing to find for our organization. We would love to hear more stories. We would love to be able to share those stories. These are lessons, and every story is different. It's very important to share.
A few other comments in the chat. There's one that said 6 million people might be all the people who live in all of New England. So that might bring things into focus for people.
Imagine, yes. Could you imagine all of New England being wiped out? It's
I feel so much. Oh, sorry, Debbie, go ahead.
No, that's it. It's just unfathomable. It's just unimaginable. And that's the number we're trying to teach. This unfathomable number.
The comments in the chat, but does anyone in the group have any questions? And if you do, maybe you could unmute yourself and ask them if you'd like.
Well, I thank you all for these very, very sweet comments. I really appreciate it. We work very hard to bring these lessons to the communities throughout the state. It's, you know, Vermont is an underpopulated state, but it's very spread out. So if you know someone, if you know teachers, if you know schools or communities or organizations that would be interested in our coming down, our libraries we've spoken to, or other libraries, we share these stories throughout the state. We have speakers that live in Norwich. We have speakers that live in Castleton. And of course, I live up here. Miriam Rosenblum, you may know, lives in Hyde Park, but we travel. We believe very strongly in the importance of these lessons. So please share the information. Go to our website to learn more about how you can sign up to have us come and speak in your schools and your communities.
And remember to visit the Fletcher Free Library later this month, and also the valuable information on the Vermont Holocaust Memorial's website. They're super searchable too. So if you didn't memorize the website, you can just Google Vermont Holocaust Memorial and it will pop right up and lead you there. And the contest, it's not called a writing contest, Debbie. What is it?
It's a Vermont, it's a student Holocaust education competition. It's a very straightforward name, but there's a page on our website that gives all the details for the contest.
So if you know young folks who are interested in taking a look at that and joining and doing some research on their own, I know some kids who did that last year or 2 years ago, and it was a really rewarding experience for them. One who did win a prize and one who did not, but for both of them, it was amazing. And they paid it forward because one of the kids donated the money that they won to the library. With that money, we sent out mailings to all the children that we were doing programming with leaves in it, so they could, and a self-addressed stamped envelope to the Vermont Holocaust Memorial, so they could mail the leaves that they created at home during the stay home and stay safe time in 2020. How
wonderful. Thank you, Amy. It just, you know, pass it forward. That's exactly how we learn. And it's, you know, we've had a number, I think this is our second or third, I don't remember, a second, I think, competition. We get, for this one, any kind of, almost any kind of submission is acceptable. We want students to learn in whatever way works best for them. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Debbie, for being here tonight and taking time to share the mission of Vermont Holocaust Memorial and your family's story. Thank you very much. And thank you, Lamoille neighbors, for
nice
being
to see
here.
You all. Thank you for taking part. Hope to see you at some of our events.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks for doing that, Amy and Debbie.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Deb. Well
Thank
done.
you, Rita. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you
Thank
all.
you so much. Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Debbie. Thank you.
Thanks, regards.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Debbie, I don't know if you're seeing in the chat, but there was a 16-year-old Hyde Park resident who said that he's going to look into the contest.
Great.
That's kind of cute.
That's wonderful. I'm glad to see there
Yeah.
was a 16-year-old on.
Yeah, and it sounds like there was another family who had their kids listening in, and that's pretty cool.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to look at the messages. Does that get recorded on the recording?
Not
don't
real
think so.
sure. I think that the recording is still on, so